Coming to paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Godbreaker. The man who rules the world takes on the Asgardian god of thunder in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Pre-order your copy of John Haynes, Godbreaker at online booksellers today. In a previous video, I talked about where baby boomers went wrong in raising millennials. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about where Gen X went wrong in raising Generation Z. Now, as a Gen Xer myself, I can tell most people that many of us Gen Xers really didn't get a lot of the things that we needed due to the way the last end of the silent generation and some part of the baby boomers raised their children. Because these two generations were raised in the 1960s, a very tumultuous period. What happened was that your later part of the silent generation and the baby boomers, a lot of these people, they grew up with these new age and radical ideas such as feminism, and they also grew up with a whole new way of parenting, and that new way of parenting was extremely detrimental to many of us Gen Xers. Now, because many of these last and silent generation and baby boomers grew up in the radical 60s, a lot of them were indoctrinated into ideas like feminism, and they were also indoctrinated into new age ideas of parenting like single parenting. And as a result of these two parts of a generation being indoctrinated into these ideas, many Gen Xers like myself grew up in a very dark environment for parenting because, according to the feminists, they told women that they did not need a father in the home in order to raise children. Moreover, many of the women indoctrinated into feminism, they were told either to get support from the welfare state or to go out here and get their own jobs because they could not trust a husband to go out here and take care of their families. Moreover, they further demonized fathers. So a lot of us Gen Xers, we grew up in environments where we didn't really get the foundation for support that boomers received. Moreover, a lot of times we didn't also even get economic or financial support because drugs had gotten so rampant in many areas like I grew in, like the South Bronx. So a lot of kids were growing up without being able to get many of their needs met at home, and that led to many kids not being able to get those basics as related to the support that they needed. And this made it very hard for a lot of the Gen Xers to bond with people. Now, the reason why they couldn't bond is because some mothers were on drugs and they neglected their children. Others were sent to daycare because daycare was the big thing in the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s. For many working moms, they thought, oh, I'll send my child to this daycare, and this daycare will allow them to be taken care of. Unfortunately, in those environments, these children were not given the emotional security that they needed, and in that environment, this led to the first generation of kids to grow up disconnected and detached from their parents. And that had a major impact on how Gen X raised their children, because as they raised their children in this dysfunctional fashion, they believed this to be a social norm, and they believed many of the experiences that they had were good, where they were basically left to fend for themselves in environments like latchkey environments because their mothers had to go to work, and they would give them a key, tell them to go to the apartment and just fix themselves something to eat, and then wait for them to come home. And that wait could range anywhere from 2 hours at the minimum to 8 to 10 hours if the mom wound up being held up by the boss and having to do overtime. So you had kids who were raised not with parents there or adults to give them guidance or look out for them. No, they really didn't have anyone there. And as a result, you had kids who were on their own. And as they were learning to fend for themselves, they learned things that kids should not really be exposed to. So a lot of Gen Xers, we learned a lot of things out here on our own, and we're thinking that kids should be raised that way. No, that's not a healthy way for children to be raised. Children need to know that their parents are there for them and that they should be made a priority and not a job. That is one of the worst things that Gen X has done, that they learned from the baby boomers, and it's the thing that really has messed up a lot of Generation Z, and that is, oh, I have to go out here and do things on my own without anybody to give me some support or guidance. And this is why many Gen Z kids are looking to their peers as people they respect, because they don't have any respect for adult authority figures. So this is something one of my family members observed when she was working in a daycare. She watched as kids were looking to guidance not from the adults but from the peers, and that's what happened as one of the mistakes Gen X made in raising our children. What's happening is our kids are not learning how to respect adult authority figures because they never have any sort of interaction with us. No, due to the dysfunctional way we were raised as related to being in daycare and being warehoused, what they are learning is to warehouse our own children, and we're learning to warehouse our own children. And that's a major mistake because we don't have that connection with our children. We don't have that bond with our children. And what's happening is our children are bonding with each other, and they see a peer as authority, and they don't see an adult as an authority figure. That's one mistake that Gen X has made with the kids of today as they're raising them. They're not understanding that you have to have an active relationship with your children, because if you don't have an active relationship with your children, then they don't see you as somebody that they should respect, and they don't see you as somebody that they love. No, they see you as just another roommate, and they don't see you as somebody they should regard. And that's one of the major mistakes, again, where Gen X is going wrong in raising their kids. And another mistake that I'm seeing is this over-emotional attachment to pop culture. Now, one of the big problems I'm noticing with baby boomers and Gen Xers is that a lot of us have too much of an emotional attachment to our pop culture. And as we have too much of an emotional attachment to our pop culture, we're trying to force our stories and our characters onto our kids. Now, a lot of us Gen Xers, because we grew up latchkey, we formed relationships with many TV and movie characters like Optimus Prime, Voltron, the G.I. Joe characters, and many other characters from the 80s, because we couldn't have a relationship with our parents because they were busy working, and because we were sitting there in front of the TV. What was happening was we started to form bonds with these characters, and these characters became friends to us because they were heroes in our eyes, and these heroes made us feel safe until our parents came home. So we have had an extremely emotional attachment to these characters, because what I noticed with previous generations before the baby boomers, what was happening was many people, yes, they like characters like Superman and Batman and many other characters that they grew up with, like Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet. But once they grew up and became adults, they were able to let go of those characters, and they were able to go on with their adult lives, and they were able to let the next generation discover their own characters and their own lore. Unfortunately, because a lot of kids from the latter part of the baby boomers and Gen X grew up with these characters, a lot of us have these deep emotional attachments to these characters, and we think that our kids should love these characters the same way we love these characters. And that's not the case at all, because every generation has to have their own pop culture. Every generation has to have their own cultural lore, and the kids that we're raising, they're not really getting their own pop culture, because we've got baby boomers and some Gen Xers who want to keep producing the same stories over and over again, not understanding your kids aren't connecting to it because this is their father's pop culture, and your father's pop culture cannot be your pop culture. Because as somebody who grew up with an older brother, and I saw him with his pop culture, his characters were different from my characters. And as somebody who has had a cousin who I lived with in the 90s, his characters were different than my characters. And I was cool with it, because I'm like, okay, he's got to have his own, and my brother had to have his own. And this is just us telling our stories from our experiences, and this is just us having things we relate to from our experiences from those times. And everybody has to have their own pop culture. And one of the most egregious things I'm seeing as related to Gen Xers is, we're trying to force our pop culture on our kids. And it's not fair, because pop culture is how kids discover the world. It's how they make a connection to the world. It's how they show us a picture of the world. And it's a snapshot of the times that shows us what life is like in the culture. And what's happening is that because you've got boomers and some Gen Xers holding on to their characters, constantly remaking and rebooting material, this is denying children their pop culture. And this is one of the most egregious things that Gen X is doing right now. And it's something that I'm not happy about, because I see it, the kids who got Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And got to watch shows like Static Shock and The Batman, sadly, that was the last generation to have their own pop culture in the early 2000s. And since then, we've had people holding on to pop culture like a security blanket, and they're keeping kids from finding their own life, their own culture, and defining their childhood, because you're denying kids access to their childhood because you're afraid to go out and be a full adult. Yes, I'm a toy collector and I'm saying this, but I understand, yeah, I like things like Marvel Legends and G.I. Joe Classified and many of these other toy lines, but there's got to be room for kids to go out here and find their own pop culture. There's got to be room for kids to explore their own pop culture, find out what they find to be cool, because what was cool to dad isn't going to be cool to his son, and what is going to be something that a kid of today is going to be defined by is not the same thing that was defined by my generation, which grew up with Transformers and G.I. Joe, or what my cousin grew up with Batman the Animated Series, Power Rangers, and Gargoyles. I mean, these are two different generations, but we were allowed to have our own. And what's really sad is many Gen Xers don't understand this, and they want to say, oh, my stuff is cool. I'm sorry, our stuff was cool to us in the 80s, but it's not cool to our kids, and it's not cool that they're not allowed to find and discover their world, because we've got adults who want to hold on to theirs because they fear their own mortality. And another thing that really that Gen X is doing wrong with our kids is we're not really connecting with them as people, because as they're out here and they're all alone and they're looking to their peers for guidance, they're on social media, and as they're on social media, they're not learning proper social behavior, because social media is filled with a lot of antisocial influences, and these antisocial influences on social media they are very detrimental to us. Now, I get some Gen Xers want their kids to be socially accepted by having a cell phone at a young age, but as I see it, a kid doesn't need a cell phone until they're maybe about 16 or 17 years old. I mean, the kids don't need these cell phones and to be on places like IG where they're constantly exposed to all sorts of kinds of content and content that nobody is supervising them with. And this is another mistake that Gen X is making, because many Gen Xers, we believe, oh, we were out here on our own. We were out here exposed to different type of things. I mean, as somebody who's grown up with R-rated movies and seeing things like nudity and violence, and it maybe many of us did turn out okay, but kids today need some sort of guidance, and that's something kids aren't really getting when they're on social media, because the social media, they have, again, a bond with the cell phone like they should have with their parents. And if you try to take the cell phone away, it's sort of like ripping the venom symbiote off of a person. They basically go into withdrawal, and that's really troubling because the child has more of a bond with a device than they have with other people. And that further shows the evolution of the detachment of people from other people. And that's another thing that Gen X really is making a mistake on in raising their kids, is not understanding that you're detaching from people when you're on these devices, because you're not able to understand that you have to connect with people, because people on social media, they aren't real people. This is just a representation of them. And I go in depth on this in my story, Easteen Cancel Vacation, where she deals with cancel culture. And the whole thing is, many Gen Xers aren't seeing where they're going wrong, because your kids are more connected to on things online and people online, and their representations of self online than they are to you. And this was something I noticed all the way back in the 90s when the internet was starting to get big. I said, it's really scary that you can know somebody thousands of miles away, but you don't know who your next door neighbor is. You don't know who your kids are playing with. It's really scary. You can know a stranger thousands of miles away, but you can't know who your kids are out here talking to. That's the other thing that Gen X really is not understanding the mistake they're making with raising their kids. And this is all part of how we were raised. We not understanding that, you just can't leave your kids on the internet like we were left to TV, because with television, it was controlled by several companies, and they had certain standards that the federal government, they had to follow. But with the internet, it's a wide open space, and with a wide open space, your kids can be exposed to all sorts of material, and all of that material could be stuff that they're absolutely not ready for. So a lot of us Gen Xers, we making the same mistake that our parents made in trusting in media. And that was another mistake that we grew up learning. We learned growing up, oh, okay, we were watching TV, we're all right. But the whole thing is that your kids shouldn't be in front of a television and like that, and they also shouldn't have been out here on the internet like this. No, little children really need to be supervised on the internet, and they need to be watched on the internet. That's why I'm against kids having cell phones, because all it takes is one wrong keystroke and they're exposed to pornography, they're exposed to people. And also, if they go on a place like IG, and your kids should not be on places like IG or TikTok, I mean, that's not a place I would put a young child on. But the whole thing is, we have the same idea, oh, I watched R-rated movies as a kid. Well, this is worse than an R-rated movie. Your kids are interacting with strangers, and if anybody who grew up in the 80s, we all know you don't talk to strangers. But what's really interesting is people let their kids talk to strangers on these platforms when they let them have these devices. And that's another thing, again, this attachment to devices. This is where we're going wrong with our kids. because, again, our kids have a stronger bond with a device than we do, and that should scare you, because your kids should not be bonding with a device. No, they should be bonding with you, and they should be getting close to you as you do things like read them stories and spend time with them. This is something that's important, because these are moments in your child's life that will shape and define who they are. These are some of the great memories that your child is going to have, and they're really going to, when you don't really look out for your kids online, you're missing out on the greatest moments of their life. Now, another thing that I noticed that Gen X is making a mistake on with their kids is not walking around with them and letting them see the world. Now, in the 80s, when I was growing up, before the crack epidemic came along, kids would get on their BMX bikes, and if they lived in the suburbs, they go out to the 7-Eleven, go get their comics. I used to just walk down to the bodega and get my comics, and kids would go to places like, I used to go to 3rd Avenue in the Bronx, or 167th Street, and around the Grand Concourse, and we would go walk in places. But kids these days, they don't get to go out much, and it's really affecting their interpersonal and social skills. A lot of kids out here, they're just locked up in the house, and they're locked up in the house with the internet, and they're experiencing a virtual world, but they're not experiencing the real world. I mean, that's something one of my family members, we were talking about. You know, you don't really see kids going out with their BMX bikes or their scooters or stuff like that. I mean, it's one of those things you don't really get to see much anymore. And it's really bad for children, because children need to get out. They need to exercise. They need to breathe. They need that open space. And a lot of us Gen Xers, because we grew up in extremely violent times like the crack epidemic of the late 80s and the crime waves that are associated with it, we're afraid to go out, because we're afraid of getting killed in a homicide. We're afraid of getting caught in things like drive-by shootings, and we're caught up in a lot of trauma. So what we do is shelter our kids, and when we shelter our kids, what we're doing is more harm than good, because yes, your kids are safe, but what they are in is an antisocial environment where they're on this internet and they're not out in the world experiencing people, experiencing places, experiencing life, and them not being able to experience the world like we used to when we had our BMX bikes before crack came along. You had brothers and sisters and people, again, going out, going to the movies, going out to restaurants, going out and living life. But we don't see that, because we have a lot of Gen Xers who grew up in the crack epidemic, and then we had the COVID pandemic, and we've got people inside of homes. And if anybody read the book Crime and Punishment, we know that isolation does things to people's mental health, and it's a major mistake to leave your kids out in these isolated places where they're warehoused, and then they're brought back to the home, and all they've got is the internet, and the internet can become an echo chamber, and that's what we're seeing that's leading to many of these males, like I talk about in the Man Crisis, becoming these incels. They're isolated for extended periods of time, and they're listening to people online instead of taking a trip outside to their local store, or going out on a trip, or just going for a walk. They're not seeing the world, and they're learning to be afraid of the world, because that's another thing that Gen X is teaching their kids, to be afraid of the world and being afraid of people. They're not teaching them an objective analysis of, going out and experiencing life. What they're doing is trying to instill fear in people as related to things, because they grew up in a world of terror. Because a lot of us Gen Xers, we did grow up in a lot of terror. I mean, we grew up without our parents there. We grew up without any sort of guidance. We had to go out here and figure things out on our own. We had to go out here and do things. And some of those things were positive, because we did learn how to go out here and work alone. We learned how to work out and problem solve. But one of the things we don't really know how to do very well is trust other people. And that's something that's bad, because if you can't trust other people, then how can you raise your kids? Because your kids learn trust from you, and if you don't trust other people, you can't trust your kids, and that's going to make it hard for you to have a relationship and bond with your kids. So Gen Xers, we have to really rethink the way we are raising kids, because the way we're raising kids is leading to a lot of kids having some really serious issues as related to socializing and navigating the world. And it's really hurting a lot of kids because the kids are growing up. They're being exposed to things, and they're being exposed to things without guidance. And sadly, it's like a vicious cycle. The dysfunction we learned as kids, we're passing on to our children because we're not really taking a critical look at how we're raising kids. We're doing the same things that our parents did. Oh, we're going to work and make this money and buy them stuff, but we're not looking out for our kids' emotional needs, because our kids' emotional needs should be the most important thing, because emotionally secure kids can go out here and they can feel secure to go out here and take risks. They can feel secure enough to go out into the world, and they can feel secure once they get those needs met. Then they can go out here and look to go out here and accomplish things. So Gen X, we have a lot of things we need to do, because if we don't look out for our kids, we're going to wind up raising our kids in the same kind of dysfunction that's led to many of the boys becoming men in crisis and women becoming women in crisis. Now, this was a video requested by one of my viewers, and if you want to request a video, you can send a donation to the Cash App, and if I know something about that subject, I will make that video for you. And if you want to see me, and if you want to pick up some of my positive books on the SJS Direct imprint, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, you can find all those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find all those books at other online booksellers like Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.